Hello, welcome again to Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. I hope all of you are doing well today. During the previous 3 lectures, we have had an interesting roller coaster ride on various aspects of literature, and we also went through a couple of very exciting stories. I am sure you enjoyed all those stories. Before we go to the 4th lecture, let us have a very quick recap of what we did in the previous class, right? Okay. We discussed how literature has an extraordinary ability, almost to the extent we can call it spiritual ability. What is the spiritual ability? The ability to get under our skin and transform us from within. Literature has that ability. How literature does that? We discussed that. We also discussed this concept of Parakaya Pravesha, especially a concept that is quite relevant to understanding the philosophy of Shankaracharya, and how literature achieves this philosophical vision, this philosophical feat of Parakaya Pravesha. We discussed that. We also discussed in the context of the origin of Ramayana, we discussed how in the case of Valmiki, the shoka was transformed into becoming a shloka, and how that became a kind of an epic template for the Ramayana to begin, that shokam shlokatva magataha, that particular shloka related to the death of the Crauncha bird and the subsequent cursing of Valmiki curses the hunter. We have discussed that, how that becomes almost an epic template of or an epic template for the Ramayana. And we also discussed how literature acts as a catalyst in enhancing the empathy within us. Please remember, literature makes us more humane. Literature makes human beings more humane. And also we discussed another interesting concept, how while being rooted in the local, it appeals to the universal, it appeals to the global. Invoking Ngugi wa Thiong'o's concept of glocal, it is a portmanteau term. We discussed what a portmanteau term is. We said that literature in its true sense is glocal, always, almost always, because while being rooted in the local, it appeals to the global. That is why it is a global one in its spirit and aspiration. And we also discussed how literature benefits us in terms of enhancing our analytical skills, in terms of enhancing our reading, writing and other cognitive skills and things like that. In today's class, we are going to discuss another important aspect related to understanding literature. Until now, we discussed defining literature. We defined literature using various definitions, various short stories, fables and things like that, and how despite these discussions, our idea of literature should keep evolving. Otherwise, these are at the end of the day just fragments. These are fragments of our understandings of literature and how it should keep evolving. And in this class, taking a slightly different strand, we are going to discuss on how we are going to read literature and appreciate it. Before that, let me discuss 2 aspects of language. Every language, whatever is the language, it has 2 components to that. One is the communicative component, the other is the literary component. The communicative component is what you and I keep using every day. When you and I speak a particular language, be it Hindi, be it Tamil, be it Bangla, whatever language it is, we participate in a kind of a communion. What kind of a communion is it? When we speak with each other in our language, we participate in a kind of a linguistic communion, and thereby we share our emotions with others. We also listen to them, and thereby we participate in enhancing our collectivistic sense of community, right? That is the first aspect, the communicative turn. We can even call two turns of language. One is the communicative turn, the other is the literary turn. And the literary turn is what is interesting. In its literary dimension, language acts as a custodian of culture. Remember, the concept of history is of recent origin, especially in India. The concept of history in the sense of Western notion of history is of recent origin. Earlier, if you have noticed, most of our historical elements were passed on to us either in the form of an epic or in the form of tales, novels and things like that. What I am trying to say here is that literature acts as a kind of a custodian of a culture, thereby it preserves culture and also passes it on to the next generation. So, if we remember this aspect of literature, then our appreciation and our admiration for literature almost doubles, because here literature is not just a piece for reading and enjoying. On the other hand, it also acts as a preservative agent. It acts as a preservative agent of a culture, of a tradition, of a society, of a people's belief, value system and things like that. Therefore, our appreciation and admiration for literature almost doubles. Here, let me invoke an important book called Ways of Seeing by renowned British novelist and poet John Berger. By analyzing various important paintings, he puts forth the concept of seeing from a fresh perspective. The crux of the book, of course, we can't reduce a book to a single sentence, but the spirit of the sentence is to say that human beings develop the faculty of seeing much before they develop the faculty of speaking, right? If you observe a child, much before the child starts speaking, it starts seeing things, So, the faculty of seeing develops before the faculty of speaking. What literature does, by offering us multiple perspectives, by presenting the story before us, by presenting a vision before us, by presenting a value set before us, it helps us see things from multiple perspectives. In other words, it creates a multitudinal understanding of a singular concept. So, it works in that sense that it acts as a kind of a corrective agent. By the time we start reading literature, we will have already picked up both the skills of seeing and speaking. So, what it does a kind of a retrospective job of going back to the roots and correcting the way we look at society. So, thereby it enhances our understanding of society. It develops new ways of seeing, it develops therefore new ways of speaking about it, right. When we change the way we see society, automatically there is a change in the way we communicate about it. Therefore, if you really wish to enhance your communication skills, you wish to learn to see things from a different perspective. Therefore, this is where of course we can see the spirit of literature influencing communication skills. And here is a very interesting quote by 20th century French writer Marcel Proust. Reading is that fruitful miracle of a communication that happens in the middle of solitude. So, I said earlier that reading is an activity wherein a soul starts interacting with itself first and then interacts with the world around, and all this happens in the universe of silence. Marcel Proust, major literary figure, symbolist, modernist, who has had an extraordinary influence on modernist British writers. Moving on from here, we are going to discuss various elements of literature. These elements of literature are not particular to one particular form or any form of literature, be it poetry, be it novel, short fiction, drama. Here I am going to list out a couple of elements of literature. An awareness of this is going to help us in understanding and appreciating literature all the more. Remember, in this class we are going to focus on how we are going to learn to read literature and to appreciate it better. So, in order to do that, facilitate that, we are going to focus on some important concepts, some important elements of literature. I am not going to delve deeply in this class. I am not going to delve very deeply about these concepts. I am just going to introduce a kind of a cursory introduction to these elements. As classes roll by at relevant place, we are going to take up these concepts for a detailed discussion. The first thing that comes is point of view. Even in poetry, but more so in fiction, short fiction and drama, perspective or point of view plays a very important role. Remember, a novel accommodates various characters, right? Each character has its own perspective, its own way of perceiving the reality. When different perceptions of realities are presented before us, what happens is there is a kind of a clash between the competing versions of the realities, and thereby it gives us a plethora of options to look here and there or to look everywhere and pick the right perspective or to accommodate all the perspectives to an extent possible. So, therefore, to understand the perspective in a work of art becomes very important. If you can identify what is the viewpoint, what is the point of view. Is it the author's viewpoint? Because remember, not everything in a novel, not everything in a short story is an author's perspective. An author may as well differ from what his or her characters are speaking. We must always remember that. One of the first mistakes we do when we are exposed to literature during the initial days, of course, is to confuse authorial voice with the voice of the characters. They are separate. What the character says is different from, or it need not be the same as what the author says. Once we identify this, then the rest of it is a kind of a smooth journey. The second thing is, we need to identify various figures of speeches. These figures of speeches are used aplenty in literature, especially in poetry, but also in other forms of literature, in other genres of literature. So, symbol, for time being we are going to focus on symbol. A symbol is an object that represents an abstract idea or whose meanings are much deeper than what they appear at the surface. In order to understand a symbol, you must go beyond or you must go beneath the surface and get to the bottom. Only then we would be able to understand a symbol. The next is theme. Usually nobody writes a novel or no great writer writes anything with a set theme in mind. There is a broad template, I want to write about something, but what is the particular theme nobody would know. But when a work of art is produced, it would invariably have various thematic elements. So, if we can identify the overall theme of the work of art, whether it is a novel or a short story or a drama or a play or a poem, if we can identify that, well, we know how to read literature to a certain extent. Okay. And of course, characters, we know various characters come, and these characters are as good as real people. That is the reason why I was saying that if connecting with real people in the world around us is not possible, at least connecting with the characters that we read in literature, they help us a lot. They help us a lot. And continuing our discussion on elements of literature, the next is tone. What is the overall mood of the work? Is it one of a pessimistic tone? Is it one of the positive tone? Is it one of the neutral tone? What is the tone? If we can learn to identify the overall tone. Please remember, most of the times the canvas of the novel is so big, or the canvas of a literary work is so big, it would have multiple moods. But what is an underlying mood is something that we need to understand. Okay. The second thing is setting. Setting plays a very important role, because remember, if it's a novel, especially if it's a novel or a short story or a play, it has to be set in a particular social context. What is the society in which it is located? What is the time period in which it is located? What is the cultural context in which it is located? What is the political context in which it is located? These act as filters. Setting acts as filters. There are very many filters through which the theme gets developed. We must identify what is the setting. Most of the times it is not just one. As I said, it would be a combination of many things. We must gradually learn to identify, and I am sure we will do that. We will learn to identify in the due course of time. Plot. There is a difference between plot and story. Plot is not what is said, but how it is said, the sequence of events, the sequence of action. That is very important. We are going to discuss all these elements, especially when we come to discussing fiction and short fiction. I am just introducing you so that an idea of these things will help you to understand it all the more when we come to discussing novels. So, when you are introduced to these concepts, please do a little more work on your own. I am sure you will be rewarded in very many ways. The next is narration. Narration is very much important for us because again, a work of art will have multiple narrative techniques. Is it the first person narration? Is it the author speaking? If it is the author speaking, it is called omniscient narrative strategy. An author, as if knowing everything, he or she would speak. It is an omniscient narration. Or if it is first person, the character, the protagonist starts speaking. So, it is the first person narration, second person narration, third person narration. So, we must learn to identify the narrative voice. Then it helps us understand the context a little better, and also it helps us in understanding the perspectives. It is linked to the perspective. Okay. Language plays a very important role. We have already discussed this in one of the earlier classes, right? Literature is about form and content. What you say is equally important like how you say it, or how you say is as important as what you say. Okay. So, here we must pay attention towards the choice of word. Why does a writer use a particular word? See, it is a myth. All of us have heard of synonyms, right? Synonyms, multiple, you can use one word in the place of other. You have dictionary of synonyms and things like that. But philosophically speaking, no two word is alike, though it may give an impression that it is alike. No two words are alike. There is a difference, at least in terms of a shade, it is different. So, a language does not have any redundant word. It is said, Bhaktin says that no language has a redundant word. All words are important. For our sake, we call it a synonym or something. It means same, but otherwise the shades of meanings are different. So, we must pay particular attention towards the shades of meaning when we say choice of words here. And also various other literary techniques such as figures of speech, metaphor, simile, personification. All these things, various literary techniques, we need to pay attention towards it, and we are going to discuss them in detail in subsequent classes. Having been made familiar with certain common elements in elements of literature, now we are going to focus on how literature is a slow reading activity. In fact, this is a phrase popularized by Nietzsche, well known philosopher Nietzsche. He often called literature a slow reading activity, and unfortunately that slow reading activity is on the decline, especially these days where fast is the new mantra of our age, speed is the new mantra of our age. So, talking of slowing that becomes slightly anachronistic, slightly out of time, isn't it? Anachronistic. Nevertheless, reading is a slow activity. Why is it a slow activity? Because it involves an interaction with yourself. Reading is basically an interaction with oneself, right? That requires a lot of pauses, lot of introspection, lot of critical analysis. Only then you accept what you read, isn't it? Therefore, it is a slow activity. And because it's a slow activity, most of the times we may not be able to understand a work of art in a single reading. We might require multiple readings. In fact, one of the classic definitions of a classic is that a classic is a work of art which never exhausts meaning. The more you read, the more number of times you read, the more layers of meanings you discover, right? Therefore, if you do not understand a work of art in the very first go, especially it happens with poetry, right? When you read a poem, sometimes you feel you don't understand what the poem is speaking. Do not bother, do not lose your heart, because the soul of the poem resides not in the meaning. More of it later when we discuss poetry. But remember, do not lose your heart. Please start reading, giving it one more reading. Read it twice, read it 3 times, and I am sure you will benefit a lot. The more number of readings you do, the more layers of meanings you discover, you unearth. Okay. When you read, what happens is, most of the times a great work of art, it unsettles you. It takes you out of your comfort zone and unsettles you, and that is the reason why you need to have an open mind, an active mind, because it keeps challenging us. Reading keeps challenging us. What does it challenge? It challenges the prevalent notions. It challenges our preconceived biases. Reading challenges our well established notions. That is the reason why we need to take it slowly, because it keeps challenging us. And when we are challenged, when a literary work challenges us, then what do? We pause, we adjust what we have until that point of time understood with what we are about to understand now. There is a kind of a recalibration that takes place, and then a new understanding comes, a new insight arrives. That's how we grow. Because reading entails with it growth, it is often challenging, more often than not unsettling and challenging. So, no problem with that. What is it that when we hear our teachers, when they are about to explain literature, when they are about to deal with literature, they say you have to read in between the lines. What do we mean by reading in between the lines? Most of the times we have always said this, right? You have to dig deeper. There are 2 types of meanings. Generally there are 2 types of meaning. One is the dictionary meaning, the other is the symbolic meaning, otherwise denotative meaning, the connotative meaning. A word has 2 values to it, the denotative value, the connotative value. The denotative value is the dictionary meaning of it, the connotative value is a contextual value. Please remember, a text always makes sense in a context in which it is written. Even if you parse the word context, context, con means deceptive, a text is often deceptive, right? So, that is why in order to understand a text, you must put it in the context in which it is written, context, and you must put the word in the world in which it is written, a word in the world, text in the context. That is what is called reading in between the lines. Go behind the layers of meanings, go beneath the superficial meaning, so that we can explore a little more. For instance, most of the times when you look at the titles of the novels, sometimes they are abstract, sometimes you would be able to make out. When, say for instance, Swami and his friends, a kind of children's classic, that should not prevent you from reading it, because it's simply a kind of a misnomer. When we say it's children's literature or young adult literature, we assume it's only for young adults or children. No, in fact, even when an adult reads it, he or she will be able to benefit immensely from that. So, when you read it, obviously you make sense, Swami and his friends. Maybe it's about the character called Swami, a protagonist called Swami and his friends, or iconic novels by Mulk Raj Anand, Coolie or Untouchable. They are quite self-evident. So, you need to identify it because they provide a kind of a wider context. The Wasteland, again by T.S. Eliot. So, I am just giving you some examples. So, they give you a kind of a context. Once you broadly understand the context, then probably you go a little deeper and understand the deeper meanings. And how do we read actively is something that we let's quickly go through. Mark unfamiliar words, quickly underline what you don't know so that you can come back and understand it. Keep track of your feelings and your responses to that, to the text. Jot it down, note down in a notebook. And yeah, when you are reading, ask important questions. They are very, very important. As I said, reading is not to be done in a hurry, but reading is something that you do in leisure. It's a kind of a leisurely activity. Therefore, keep asking important questions. So, here is a continuation of how to do. Let me quickly take you through all these things. Identify the themes if you can quickly do that, or underline important ideas, or if it's an important quotation, we keep doing that. Let's continue doing that, and if possible, let's try to understand and interconnect things. Let's try to interconnect things and work out what are the kind of relationships that exist within the text and things like that. And finally, let's summarize the main ideas or the important things. If we are of course, see, you don't need to do all that if you are reading a work of art for pleasure, but if you are taking it a little deeper, then maybe when you do all these things, you will be exposed to different dimensions of literature. You are exposed to the deeper dimensions of literature. So, for time being, let's stop this class. In this class, we have learned some important elements of literature. By elements of literature, what we mean, some of the common things that come. So, our understanding of these concepts, our understanding of these elements will help us in enhancing our experience of literature. That is the reason why these are some common understanding of literature. And we also learnt how to read systematically, how to exploit the process of reading and optimize its benefits. Now, I am going to introduce a very important concept in literature. It is called intertextuality. I said we would minimize the use of jargon. So, but this is one exceptional jargon that we need to learn. Intertextuality is a literary concept that was popularized in the 60s by a noted theorist called Julia Kristeva. As the term suggests, there is a kind of an interlink between texts. I am not talking about, until now we talked about how to understand a literary work better, but now I am talking about the kind of interconnections that exist across literary works. In other words, what happens, what am I trying to say here? I am saying that if you, like a geologist, when a geologist explores soil, he or she would explore different layers of soil, right? There are different layers of soil. What you call, soil has multiple layers, they are called horizons. Similarly, a text will have different layers, they are called palimpsests. There are palimpsestic layers. An active reader or a sensible reader would be aware of the presence of multiple texts within a text. This is called intertextuality. In that sense, stories grow out of other stories, poems out of other poems, novels out of other works. There is always, in that sense, there is nothing which is original. Always a literary work is borrowed in its true sense, because it is influenced by some work or the other. But some literary pieces are rooted in such a manner that when you read them, you automatically start listening to some echoes if you are a sensible reader, you start listening to the echoes of some other texts in them. That is called intertextuality. Say for instance, there are some important works. For instance, you will have watched Disney's The Lion King, right? It also, a sequel also came out. It is borrowed from Shakespeare's Hamlet. If you have read Hamlet, I am sure you start locating traces of Hamlet in this movie, children's movie, but that shouldn't prevent us from watching as well. Same is the case with James Joyce, Ulysses, a major Irish writer, 20th century writer, a modernist, and this is a very important work, Ulysses. Ulysses is indebted to the Greek classic Odyssey by Homer. Again, readers who are exposed to both the literary works would be able to find traces of Odyssey in Ulysses. Similarly, you have, if you watch this Omkara movie by Vishal Bharadwaj, it is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Othello, but a creative adaptation. So, something like this, you start listening to the echoes of a text in another text. This is called intertextuality. When you have learned to spot this, that means your journey as a reader is quite impressive, because you are able to make some wonderful interconnections across the texts. Right? In that sense, reading becomes a kind of a process of moving across texts, moving between texts, some kind of an interstitial activity, or interdimensional activity, moving between spaces. Reading appears like that, or you perceive reading to be a kind of an enterprise between moving between spaces. Finally, let us remember one thing. Structurally speaking, our eyes are located in such a way that they are made to look at what is outside them. Our eyes are located in such a way that they are made to look what is outside them. But literature, it has the capacity to invert the gaze. What it does, it inverts the gaze, as a result of which, you start looking within. You start looking within. When I say start looking within, please connect it with the story of the Buddha, layers of consciousness, the person standing on 7th floor, which we discussed probably in the first or the second class. Start connecting it. It turns the gaze within, it inverts the gaze, and as a result of it, when you read, you start introspecting yourself. What is happening within you? What is happening to me? So, that is an extraordinarily rewarding enterprise. And philosophically or spiritually speaking, it is said that the true salvation lies when you know yourself. Know then thyself. When you know yourself, in fact, Shankaracharya, after having known himself, he went on to declare that Aham Brahmasmi. You have heard of that, right? I myself am the Brahman, ultimate. But that is the product of a realized being. When we realize who we are, what we are capable of doing, that is the ultimate reward literature offers. By inverting our gaze, it helps us look for answers within, and it helps us come to terms with who we are, what we are. I am sure these introductory things will have helped in enhancing your experience with literature, and they must have given you cues as how to read and thereby enhance our appreciation for literature. Thank you. Let us discuss other concepts in the next class.